Okay, welcome everyone. So I'm Sarah Young. I'm the co-chair of the ISS Professional Development Committee, along with Wei Yin, who's joining us today as well. And we're really excited to have folks here from IPUMS to talk about their amazing resources and data, and really focusing on the Latin American data that they make available. Just wanted to say a few words. This is a webinar that's co-hosted by ISS's Professional Development Committee, along with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Interest Group. And if you are a member of ISS already, wonderful. Welcome back. I'm sure you're aware of the many great professional development opportunities we offer through the organization. If you are not a member of the organization, I encourage you to think about joining. The registry or the joining membership fee is quite low. I will put a link into the chat in just a moment, so you can check out more about the organization. All right, so I will, with that, go ahead and turn it over to Deb and Anne, who are going to introduce our speakers today. And I should say we are going to take questions primarily via Zoom chat. So if you have those, please go ahead and put them into chat when you think of them. We'll probably loop back at the end of the talks to address those. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, my name is Ann Zold. I'm a librarian and a member, ISS member. I'm currently at Northwestern University, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Laura Cleveland and Rodrigo Lavaton, are both affiliated staff at the IPUMS organization in Minneapolis. Laura is a researcher at the University of Minnesota's Institute for Social Research and Data Innovation, where she directs the international microdata projects of IPUMS. Laura holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Minnesota. Rodrigo Lavaton is a researcher at IPUMS International, where he supervises the processing and the harmonization of new census and survey data sets. Rodrigo holds a PhD in applied economics and a master's in public policy, also from the University of Minnesota. It's my great pleasure to welcome them, and I turn the floor, or the podium to them. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here. We're very excited to reach this audience, and I'll let Rodrigo introduce himself, and he's up first.
We are very happy for the opportunity to reach the ISS audience. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rodrigo Lobaton, and I work on data processing for the IPUMS International project. So we're going to be talking about using IPUMS International with a focus on race and ethnicity in Latin America. So let's get started with our agenda for today. We are going to start with a short introduction to IPUMS and IPUMS International, mainly the data availability and the advantages for users. We are going to then cover specifically some variable availability or data availability for race, indigenous population, ethnicity, and language. And we're going to do finally a quick demonstration of the data dissemination system, mainly browsing variables and looking at documentation online. And we are planning to have a short section of questions at the end of each of the sections. But please, if there are any pressing questions, you can interrupt us at any point. Let me start by saying that IPUMS is part of a broader institute at the University of Minnesota. This is the Institute for Social Research and Data Innovation that also is home to different centers devoted to population, aging, and life course research. IPUMS provides census and survey data from around the world. The data are harmonized across time and space. And it is the integration of the data and the documentation that makes it easy to study change, to be able to conduct comparative research, to work with different data types, and to analyze individuals in the context of their families and communities. All of the data and services offered by IPUMS are completely free of charge. And our mission is to preserve, harmonize, and disseminate census and survey data And in 2023, we celebrated 30 years of disseminating harmonized data. And the IPUMS family includes different data projects. We are at IPUMS International, but there are other data projects that are part of IPUMS, and each of the different projects works with different data sources. And among them, IPUMS USA and IPUMS International work primarily with census microdata, although there is some labor force and population surveys also in international. We have different survey projects. I'm gonna refer only to IPUMS Global Health, which includes harmonized data from the demographic and health surveys, the performance monitoring for action surveys, and the multiple indicator cluster surveys. All of them are international health surveys. And finally, we have also two projects that offer tabular population data, both international and for the US, aggregated at different levels of geography. And altogether, all of these projects constitute the largest population database in the world. And as you can see here, we have represented more than 150 countries, more than 1,000 census and survey data files, more than 2 billion person records, with about 300,000 data users that are constantly creating data requests for research. And each of the different projects is unique, but we have some common characteristics in IPUMS. Most of the data projects are microdata at the individual level. All of the data are anonymized, so we don't have any identifying information. As I mentioned, the data are harmonized because we assign consistent codes and labels across countries and years. And each of the IPUMS projects has its own web-based dissemination system where users can create extracts with specific data sets and variables. All of the data and metadata are standardized. And again, as I mentioned, everything is completely free of cost for the users. This is our landing page. IPUMS International specifically is an effort to preserve and harmonize international census and survey microdata to be used in research and teaching. And of course, our work would not be possible without the generous collaboration of a number of national statistical institutes from around the world who let us work with the data that they produce. This is a representation of the coverage, of the geographic coverage of the IPUMS International data collection. All of the countries in blue are countries for which we are currently disseminating microdata. In light blue, we have historical data from before 1950. And in green, we have some other countries that are partners of the project for which we hope to be able to disseminate data in the near future. And as you can see in the map, the Latin American region, which is our focus for the webinar today, is one of the regions of the world with better representation. We have 25 countries in the data collection with 110 census samples going back to the 1960s until the most recent census round. And altogether in the IPUMS International data collection, we have more than 1 billion person records, 547 census and surveys, and 103 countries represented. IPUMS International in particular offers microdata, and on the right-hand side, we have a visual representation of what would be a microdata set, where the unit of observation is a person, and we can see some specific columns that represent different questions in a census, and very often persons are also organized into households. Most of the census samples in IPUMS International are a 10% sample of the population, and they include a broad availability of census variables. And of course, a key advantage of working with microdata is that it is more flexible in terms of doing some more custom analysis. We can produce our own tables and do more complex analysis and statistical estimation. And why is it advantageous to use IPUMS data for research? The main idea is that IPUMS facilitates comparative research across time and space. because of different features of the data and the data dissemination system, and I'm gonna just mention some of them. We have harmonized census samples. So all of the data and metadata are converted into a common format. And also in terms of the access for the user, the user interacts with a single database that includes all of the censuses and all of the variables together. But the most important contribution of IPUMS to the data is the harmonization process. That means that we offer variables that have a common coding structure across the different censuses, across countries and across time. And in order to retain the most detail possible from the original variable, we use a composite coding structure where we have one first digit with some more general information widely available, and additional digits with more specific information available only in some censuses and surveys. And everything is offered through this online dissemination system for easy access. So users can create custom data extracts where they select the specific samples and variables that are relevant for their research. And we have different documentation available for users as well, including, for example, census questionnaires, instructions for enumerators, among others. And we have also other tools in the web dissemination system, such as an online tabulator. We also offer shapefiles so that users can do a spatial analysis of the data, among other features. And I wanted to provide a quick example of this data harmonization that we do. Here we have an example for marital status. And we have 3 variables from different censuses. We have the Bangladesh 2011, Mexico 1970, and Kenya 1999. And if a researcher wanted to look at these variables across the different censuses, they would need to probably invest some time in going through the documentation to understand each of the response categories and to be able to establish equivalences across them. And that is precisely the work that we do to facilitate research. So if we take these 3 variables and put them together into what we call a translation table, that is basically a correspondence table between the original responses and the harmonized codes. So first, we line up all of the responses that are equivalent. And for example, this happens for unmarried in Bangladesh, single in Mexico, and never married in Kenya. And then we assign a harmonized code and a harmonized label. So this harmonized code and label will be available across all 3 data sets. And we can see that that is the code 100 single. This is easier for the single category, a little bit more complicated for persons who are married or in union, and this is where the composite coding structure comes into play. So in the first digit, we distinguish between persons who are single from those married or in unions. In a second digit, we distinguish between persons who are in formal marriages from those in consensual unions. And in additional digits, we have additional distinctions between, for example, civil and religious marriages or monogamous and polygamous unions. So we do similar work for persons who are divorced or separated and for persons who are widowed. So the user can work with this 3D version of marital status that is consistent across, or if they prefer, they can also work with a more general version that has even more consistent codes across the different census samples. I wanted to close this general section with some examples of research applications using IPUMS International. Since we are talking about race and ethnicity in Latin America, we have a few examples of papers using the data collection for this purpose. The IPUMS International users belong to a wide variety of disciplines such as economics, demography, sociology, among others. And it is because of this disciplinary diversity and also the thematic breadth of the IPUMS data collection that they work on a variety of research projects. And here we have, for example, implications of race and gender gaps in educational attainment for union formation in Latin America. This is one cross-country analysis using different countries in the data collection. characterizing the indigenous forest peoples of Latin America. This is also another cross-country analysis creating profiles for indigenous population. We have some examples, for example, here a case of Trinidad and Tobago, where they are looking at inequalities, racial inequalities, how they are changing. And then parental transmission of ethnic identification in mixed couples in Latin America. And this is looking specifically at one ethnicity in one specific country, Chile. But this will be just a few quick examples of research projects with the data collection. If anybody's interested, we have a bibliography tool where you can actually search by topics, keywords, other work that has been done with the data collection. And we're going to end with this section with some questions, if there are any questions.
I don't see any. There was one question in the chat which we were able to answer, but related to the Americas Barometer and if it was complementary to your data. But if you have any comments on that, otherwise, I'm not seeing any other questions.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, my mute button moved somehow to the top of my screen, so it took me a second there. Thanks, Rodrigo. I just want to say from myself how excited we are to be here and happy to talk about the data. I want to start this section on race and ethnicity by saying that neither Rodrigo nor I are specifically race or ethnicity scholars, and this is a very complex thing to measure. So we are thrilled to be here to tell you what data are available, and we're also really proud that we put a lot of documentation at the hands of our users so that they can investigate the substantive meaning and figure out how to use the data responsibly. So we're here to tell you about all those good things and to try to provide a few references that might get you started on the more substantive complexity of these variables. But we will see that very quickly when we look at harmonization. Just to get us started, in bold, you see some names of the available variables that measure race and ethnicity characteristics. As Rodrigo said, we have the most comprehensive coverage in Latin America of any of the regions of the world in terms of data. All countries in the world, well, not all countries, but many countries in the world were delayed in their 2020 censuses. We were a little bit constrained in what we could do to go out asking for the censuses that were ready in that early 2020 period. And so some of the census 2020 round are not in IPUMS yet, but we know that many of them are coming in and we're really eager to get those up and online. So if you don't see the latest data from country or countries you're interested in, check back. We're trying to get those up as soon as we can after we receive them. So we have a variable called race, which measures race or color as defined by the country across all countries. So that's harmonized across country. Indigeneity is a important concept in Latin America, maybe identified more commonly there than in some of the other regions of the world. And also information about whether or not people speak an indigenous language. So those are also available across countries. These variables below the dotted line are available in many countries, but our harmonization is done within a country across time. So these underscores represent the two-letter country code that actually comes after each of these names. So across time in Bolivia, we have an ethnic BO, so for each country, there may be one or more of these variables at the bottom. And we'll take a look at some examples to give you a flavor of that. I would call our harmonization here nominal for the most part. We align groups that have the same name. We do a little bit of investigation of the concept, especially with regards to race, but we are not truly investigating the conceptual similarity. We are trying to put as much information in your hands as we can and align groups that were called the same thing within a country, and within a group internationally where those things appear to be similar or the same. As we know, race, ethnicity concepts, labels comprise many concepts. So Latin America, often there's an idea about color. Explicitly in Cuba, we changed the name of our race variable to say race or color, when Cuba objected very strongly to our putting that information in a variable that was only called race. So ancestral, something about a group's history based on the location they came from, their origin. Things like cultural similarities, much more complex to define. And so I'm sure as social scientists, you are all highly aware of this. I just want to acknowledge it as well, and say that this particular session isn't about digging deeply into all of those concepts, but getting you a sense for what data are available in these IPUMS censuses. So as I just said, that means that harmonization can be difficult. Comparison, even where we've harmonized, can be tricky. And so even within a country, things with a similar concept might shift over time. And then, of course, people's identity formation evolves over time. And so as we have new ideas about how we define ourselves, a person might show up in a different group in a subsequent census than how they identified in the prior census. So all things to be aware of when people are doing this kind of research. Rodrigo already showed the slide about the census sample characteristics. I just bring them up again to say censuses can be a really powerful source of data to study racial groups, other small groups, disability, aging populations, those smaller groups where surveys might not have enough cases in the sample to really have the kind of statistical power that someone wants to do their research. So censuses can fill in this gap for those kinds of studies. So I'll give you some specific examples of some of these variables and the kinds of concepts that that you want to pay close attention to our documentation when you're finding variables for research. So in the case of race or color, it's available in 10 countries, multiple census years for some of these countries, but not everywhere in the region. Most of the race questions are asking the respondent to self-identify their race. We'll see an example here where they've specifically instructed the enumerator to identify the color. Again, criteria for classification might be ancestry, culture, customs, or language, also skin color or physical characteristics. And there's a variety of response categories in this variable. White and black is a distinction that's generally available across samples in IPUMS, but there are differences when it comes to defining other categories. So if we look at Cuba here, just a 3-category variable in 2002 asking about a person's skin color. So the instructions, and we'll look at these when we go to the website, provide definitions for these 3 categories, and they ask enumerators to record the response based on their observation of the person. which is unusual. I would say it's not the common method of identifying race. In contrast, in Brazil 2010, for example, just a few categories, again, mostly based on a color concept with a fifth category of indigeneity. The enumerator reads the responses to the respondent, and the respondent chooses which one they belong to, and enumerators are specifically instructed not to influence the response of the interviewee. So, you know, we'll have these people assigned in Cuba and Brazil, maybe to similar categories, but one was definitely self-identified or as much as possible in a census, and the other was identified by the person observing the respondent. These are the categories, and here we get back to what does harmonization really mean? Well, you don't have 15, 20, 30 different input codes for some category that's called white. But do we mean the same thing when we say white or black, in contrast to the other response options? That is not always clear. And that's always a danger with harmonization. We do the best we can, but I would say in the case of race or color, all these race and ethnicity variables, we are doing our best to nominally harmonize and go a little bit farther, but it's really contextually dependent. So what's convenient is that if you're going to recode this variable, you can do it with one set of input codes because we've harmonized them, as opposed to wrangling all the different censuses if you're doing comparative research. If we move to indigeneity, this is another way you might get at a race or ethnicity kind of concept. It's available in 14 of these countries across 31 censuses, multiple points in time. Hopefully with 2020 starting to fill in, we have Mexico and perhaps a few other places coming just this spring. This variable looks at whether a person is a member of an indigenous group, typically self-reported status, but it could be derived from a couple different kinds of input questions. So sometimes there's a yes/no question about indigenous group membership. Sometimes they are to name their indigenous group, often because the enumerator has a list of possible groups that the statistical office is interested in measuring, and the person picks one or sometimes more indigenous groups membership. Or there might be a race color question, like we just saw in Brazil, that has a response category about indigeneity. Here in Bolivia 2001 is a question about whether you consider yourself a member of any of the following original or indigenous groups, and there's a list to choose from. In the subsequent census, this list got a little broader, so we can take a bit of a look at what that might mean for thinking about comparisons across time. So options are red, and the respondent is to choose whether they belong to one of these categories. If they identify as indigenous, but do not fall into the named categories, then the enumerator is to pick other native category. So in a different year in Brazil, we see we have 3 categories of color, a 4th mixed category, and 5 indigenous. So similar to the one we saw earlier. The respondent replies, no interpretation by the enumerator. And anything other than the categories listed is marked as other. In addition to that indigenous identity question, there is information about language. So we found enough censuses had information about whether or not someone speaks an indigenous language. This one seems like it could be a good indicator as well. Available in 9 countries, 20 census samples. This is the only variable that's in Venezuela samples about race or ethnicity broadly. It's available 9 countries, 20 census samples, includes languages explicitly categorized as indigenous, usually from a list. Refers to the ability to speak the language. It's not necessarily about the language that you speak most commonly. And some ask about the specific language, others just ask about whether any indigenous language is spoken. And then, so all of those variables are available as a single variable that crosses countries. Then we have these ethnicity variables or language that really can't be well compared across countries without significant research and understanding of the local context. So in these cases, we've made harmonized variables that include all years from a particular country for ethnicity and for language. Together, they're available in 18 countries, 39 census samples. So the coding schemes differ by country, harmonized across time, and the categories can differ quite dramatically. We'll take a look at some of these. And then there is another variable that is mother tongue. And so we'll see a couple quick examples, and then we'll go to the website and look at how you request these data. And we'll look at all the available documentation that we have on the web. I get maybe better looked at on the web. I'm not anticipating that you can necessarily read all these categories, but you see many, many options for ethnicity provided to choose from in Ecuador. Some of them not available in different census years. Presumably, we probably didn't have quite enough cases of those to allow them to have distinct codes. So tough to study the very, very small populations from these data. Here's language spoken in Bolivia. And you can see there's an option for some of these indigenous languages versus Spanish, but then there's also an option if you speak more than one of these together. And so that takes a little bit of thought and potentially combination depending on your research topic. Ethnicity in Bolivia, I don't know if you can notice here, but we have this, I don't know how to pronounce these, Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, that are available along with Spanish here. And if we go to the next ethnicity, we see that roughly those are the same categories that are identified in this ethnicity variable in Bolivia, either because the source was the same or because they asked this in 2 different ways. But we might have populated it from a similar source into both of these if we thought it applied. But then in 2012, this list of potential groups to belong to explodes. And so trying to figure out how you might do a comparison gets tricky, is error prone, but is probably possible for some of these groups. Before I jump to the website, just so you know, I think we'll send these slides to your organizers. This is not a comprehensive search, but we put a few links that we knew about onto a couple slides. Say Paul Eklak, the Latin American Economic Commission, is the organizer and kind of coordinator of census standards for the region. And so their website about censuses has some publications, mostly in Spanish. So if you or your collaborators speak Spanish, this is probably a really great resource source. And specifically within this main website are a few publications that talk about indigeneity and Afro-descendant populations in the censuses from 2010 and in anticipation of the 2020 round. In the mid-2010s, there was a project out of Princeton. I don't know how this has evolved, but some of the publications that came out of that project regarding measurement and conceptualization of race in Latin America are listed here. As a group that includes librarians, I'm sure you can do much more thorough searches, but since we collected these in prepping for this webinar and through other channels, we thought we would just list them here. So while I switch to the website, if there's a question or two that have come in, I'd be happy to answer those.
Actually, there has been one
Okay.
from Christine who asks, when race ethnicity systems are so context dependent and not consistent across countries, what is the value added of attempting to harmonize them across countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hope while we're taking a look at the website, we'll answer that a bit. Yeah, I will say a few comments about that as we go along. Two things that immediately come to mind, and I'll repeat them when we get to the documentation on the web. One is partly to do with what researchers expect when they come to IPUMS and how we display these variables and make them available for access. So what I'm calling harmonized here is more of a coordinated coding schema and a single variable naming convention for variables that measure a similar concept. I wouldn't call this really true harmonization at the value level, but at the response code option level. But what I think is helpful here is the same thing that's helpful about all of what we do with these data, is that we've brought them all into a standard format. We've given them all a common set of variable names for concepts that are similar or the same. And we've applied a value code and label that is consistent across time and place. What that does is save all kinds of data preparation time for researchers coming to us. I really struggled in preparing these materials about whether to call this harmonization. I mean, on one level, we are applying a common coding scheme. On another level, exactly what you say. I don't want people to misinterpret that somehow these concepts that share the same code are identical in every one of these samples. So it's a great question. And it's something that I struggle with even, really finding the right words to talk about. The other part I think I will demonstrate, which is there's a lot of documentation on this website for researchers who choose to take advantage of it. And I think it makes all the difference in doing research, especially on complex topics like race and ethnicity. So that seems like a great segue into looking at the website. I'm going to pause before I go to those race variables just to show you a few things on the left navigation bar. This is IPUMS International. If you're at ipums.org, maybe we'll just go there and come right back. All of those projects that Rodrigo described are here in that grid pattern. International is one among them. But many of the microdata projects share a very similar web function, look, and feel. So if you learn one, you'll know about many. We have individually negotiated agreements with each of the countries that participate in this international census project. And so our registration standards and review are a little higher scrutiny than some of the other IPUMS projects. US data is fully publicly available. You register with us so that we can communicate with you and make sure that we can alert you if we find an error. But with international, we're actually reading these applications, vetting people to make sure they're at the organization that they say they're at, and just that there's a credible need for microdata. Like, do people understand why they specifically need these individual level records to do their research? We're not evaluating the, utility or or value of the research proposal specifically. But for those two things, that you're a certified researcher and need microdata. There's a form to fill out and it takes a few days at most to get approved to use the data. A couple other things on this left navigation bar that we're not going to cover much today, but we've spent a lot of time making geography and GIS files that correspond and have attributes of the locations identified in the place of residence variables. We've almost gotten through the migration place of residence 5 or 10 years ago variables as well. So some really useful stuff there for visualizations, mapping, that kind of thing. And then to let you know, detailed descriptions at the sample level, link from the left navigation bar as well. There are video tutorials, a user forum, some training materials, a little bit about teaching over here. So some nice resources, including like a video that shows you how to work the data request system, which I'm going to preview a little bit right now. Information about how to cite both us and the countries properly, participating countries, and the link to that bibliography that Rodrigo was talking about. So if I'm coming here to request data, I can choose select data at the top, browse data button. They all go to the same place. First time landing here, I don't find this page to be particularly friendly, but if you know a tiny bit about us, it does become quite easy. We can choose which country years if we want to limit that right up front, we can go to change samples. I'll do that in a minute. And then we have a few different ways to find the variables that are of interest for your research. These first two drop downs have groups organized by topic. So I'll quickly jump into something like utilities. Everything here is organized at the variable level. So this isn't like I'm going to have to take the whole data set, and figure out what's in there. I can pick and choose what variables are important to me. And there are two layers to this browsing screen. Here is just a list of the variable names, the variable label, and then an X indicates that it's available in that sample. This is unwieldy because you're looking at 500 plus samples here. We'll fix that in just a minute. There's a second layer, electricity here, that shows the codes, labels, a little unweighted case count view. This is household cases. And then there's a lot more documentation, and we'll jump to the race variables before I dig into this. The two layers organized at the variable level, you can access it by topic. Or if you know the variable name already, A to Z, and a search function where you can search by fertility or race ethnicity. I'm going to go limit how much we're dealing with here by changing samples. Everything is selected at the moment. Conveniently for this webinar, a couple years ago, we also made regional tabs so that you can see the subset of data that's available in the Americas, for example. Let's say I eliminate Canada, the United States, and in order to simplify, let's say I don't want anything. These are just toggle off and on from the earlier samples. Maybe you do. This is still going to be a lot of samples, but it will narrow us down just a bit. Maybe I'll make this just a little bit smaller. And now we'll look here for something that indicates race, not fertility. Maybe where someone was born, but here's ethnicity and language. Let's try that. If I just searched race or ethnicity in the search, I'd probably get race. I'd probably get all these ethnic variables. I might not get the language information. But this is the first level list of all these variables that are available. And I don't know why. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to jump back into samples. I'm seeing countries that are not in Latin America. I need to unselect everything and then go to the Americas, select them, go back. So now if I jump into race, I see that white, Black, Indigenous, Asia, that high level, more general code grouping. I see the detail within that, and I see X's where this category is available. I can see an unweighted case count view here. And you can see that for Brazil, these 3 years of Brazil, you have a pretty common set of categories. But if I keep going down here, I didn't deselect Canada. In Costa Rica, okay, similar, but then here, Indigenous, I don't see that in the next year. So same thing wasn't asked in these two censuses. I can dig into why that is. There's a short description about this variable, identifies the racial group. And then there's some comparability information that tells us generally how comparable is this, and then some specific things to look out for by country. These are all things that we write. This is originated by us as we're doing harmonization. So we call out things that are noticeable, but really importantly, we give access to the questionnaire text, both in a stripped down text form. So in Brazil, how was this question asked? What were the enumerators told? You can jump into the full context to see if you need. Some of them have, are you Indigenous or not? And then a subsequent question about which group do you belong to? Can also jump into the original form in the original language. So between what we've written about comparability and access to this questionnaire text, and even access to a source variable, so what was the input for our recode, all of which you can request at any time. So here I'm back to the main race category. Then if I think I need this, I can start adding them to my data request. So add them to the cart. Once I've selected all the variables that I want, all the samples I want, maybe I need some information about characteristics of the person, I can view the cart and start the data request process. Everything we've done so far is viewable to anyone in the public. You don't have to be registered to see it. But if I've gotten the information I want, I can create a data extract. I'll get one more page that reviews what I've selected. I can choose a different data format. So if I'm a Stata user, SPSS user, I can request data in that format. I might have to redo this. And I want to show one more thing that might be really important for things like study of race. There's a feature that allows you to attach characteristics. So I can say this variable race, I don't just want to know it about the person, but for that person, I want to know the race of their spouse. If it's a child, I want to know the race of the parents, mother and father. So if the child is living in the household with the parents, we have some features that allow you to attach that information to the other person in the household. If I'm happy with what I'm requesting, and I've done this rather quickly, I can submit this. I'm not logged, or I wasn't logged in perhaps. It should be asking me to log in if I haven't logged in already. So it's already given me codebook for this data I've requested, and it's gathering specifically those variables and those samples that I asked for in this system. Because I'm logged in here, I have a history of what I've requested in the past. I can make a revision or resubmit this request and get the data later. I want to do a different country, or I want to I forgot some variables, I want to add them to what I'm requesting, I can come back here without having to rebuild my whole extract. That was a pretty quick demo of what's on the web. I had hoped to explore some of these variables in more detail on the web. But the biggest goal was to give you a flavor of the kind of documentation that's available here to try to help address the complexity issue in these variables. So I think I'll stop there because we need some time for questions, I think.
Phew, thank you so much. Wonderfully well done. We had a question, a sort of a follow-up. I said that follow up to the question about why harmonize was that you do provide the non-harmonized data as collected by the National Statistical Office. So, and that was confirmed when we saw that option in the select screen. I don't know if you want to say anything about that option and that availability.
Yeah, I did not belabor that, and I know I was going a little bit quickly, but yes, absolutely. If we're in here and I'm, you know, ethnicity, complicated, as you saw, I mean, this does not look very comparable to me. But I could quickly, you know, run some trends. I could see, you know, where are these people living? I can break this down by region and area. I can cross tab it with other things that I think kind of go with some of these ethnic group or indigenous group categories, and explore a little bit more to confirm how comparable they are. I can see the questionnaire text, and yes, I can say for Bolivia, you're telling me you did this recoding by name. I also want those originals because I might need to do something different with them. So I can add those. I can add this ethnicity for Bolivia to my cart as well. So I've just added the source variables without jumping in them, and I've already got this in my cart. So yes. Original access is available.
Great, thank you. And just kudos from our participants about having the source questionnaires is really helpful. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, but maybe people are typing furiously. Any of our organizers want to share any questions or comments?
I would keep the questions coming in. I will stop at any moment, but I'm really glad when I was playing around last night, I did a couple quick cross tabs. I did not think we would get to this, but one more thing on the left navigation bar is an analyze data online. There's documentation about this feature. If you instructions, video tutorial, because I can't show all that today. But I went in last night because I was curious about some comparability of those questions in Bolivia. So I can request a single sample and do some fast tabulations online with a little bit of reading. I can pick, which I did last night, all of the samples for Bolivia. So in just a screen that specifies rows, columns, I can have a control variable, a selection filter. So here I took that language Bolivia by year of the sample, and I'm just looking at it for one geographic region. But if I put this geographic region in control, I would get it for all of them. And I ran the table. And what I was really looking at is, okay, over time, we have Spanish and these three groups. And then we have Spanish combined with those three groups. So are these folks picking up Spanish skills over time, or did they just report only the most salient one in the early years? I don't know. But I see everyone's Spanish ability seems to have gone up over this time. These individual language groups, this Quechua. I wish somebody would correct me on how to pronounce this, but this is waning over time, but the combined Spanish with that language are increasing over time. And so I just wanted to see if I could quickly start to explore what was going on with trends, and could I imagine these as truly comparable? I don't believe in totally letting the data drive your conclusions, especially with something like race, ethnicity. I really need to know the country context that's happening here. But with this tabulator, I mean, I'll put this variable geo1 bow in the control. Oh, no, my session expired. We can't. It just, the tabulator runs really quickly. Once you learn how to use it, you can do so many quick tabulations just to explore the data and see if it's what you want. So I didn't think I'd have time to plug that. It's a powerful tool if you use a lot of data for quick exploration. It does all kinds of complex regression, but that's an learning investment time.
Well, I'm so glad you got to share that, because that really does look like a valuable way to guide your data variable selections. So
yeah.
Where is the tabulator again?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
the last question.
It's a really
we'll be
cool
able to
tool,
take.
and I forgot we're in an audience of data junkies here. It's right here. It says analyze data online.
So from the home page. Yeah.
From the home page, and a few of our projects have it. Hopefully the instructions and video tutorial are enough to really get someone started. I love this thing. It's so fast. So I'm always happy to talk about it if somebody gets stuck.
Well, thank you to our speakers. This has been extremely helpful and very enlightening about this massive and extremely valuable resource. Thank you so much for your time and your preparation to customize this content for us. Thank you all to all of our attendees. I hope you found this helpful, and the thanks are rolling by. So I hope Laura and Rodrigo, you're soaking them up. Keep your eyes out for other webinar opportunities, learning opportunities in the future. And I believe there's an IASIS conference being prepared for sometime later this year in Halifax. Is that correct? So if you like IASIS, you can have more of it. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye.